The letter hit the floor before Hazel Flynn could catch it, and Tess Orland's hand struck the door frame so hard her knuckles split against the wood. "You were going to let me leave," she said, and her voice was barely a sound at all. "You had the money the whole time. The deed was never in dispute. You let me spend 4 months in this house believing I was charity, believing I was nothing." Hazel Flynn stood in the middle of his kitchen with the kind of stillness that men only learn after catastrophic loss. He did not move toward her. He did not reach for the letter she'd found folded inside the flour tin, tucked beneath the false bottom he'd built with his own hands 2 winters ago, the same winter his wife died and left him with a ranch he wanted to burn to the ground and a soul that felt like cold ash. His jaw was tight. His gray eyes held something too complicated to name. "Tess, don't say my name like I'm the one who did something wrong." She pressed her back against the door frame and looked at him across the length of the kitchen, across the scrubbed pine table, and the cast iron stove she had cleaned 4 months ago when it was black with neglect, across everything she had poured herself into while he stood guard over secrets she hadn't known to look for. "That letter is dated November. I arrived in October. You knew before I even took my coat off." The wind outside was doing something savage, the kind of late February howl that still had ice in its teeth, even though the calendar had turned toward March. The ranch house in the Wyoming territory creaked under it. The fire in the hearth, which Tess had laid and lit every single morning since October, crackled against the silence between them. "Tell me the truth," she said. "Tell me right now, or I walk out that door and I keep walking until I reach the next town, and I never look back at this place." Hazel Flynn looked at the woman across his kitchen, the woman who had walked into his life with a battered traveling case and 2 strong hands and more quiet dignity than anyone he'd met in 40 years of hard living, and he understood that this moment was the last gate, the one before the drop. Whatever he said next would decide everything that came after. He crossed the room in 4 steps and picked up the letter from the floor. He handed it back to her. "Read the whole thing," he said quietly. "Then tell me what you think I am." It had started the way most desperate things start, with no good options and a long road behind her. Tess Orland was 26 years old in the autumn of 1882, and she was nearly out of everything. Money, patience, a place to go. She had been working as a domestic in Cheyenne for 3 years, employed by a banker's household that had been respectable enough, until the banker's wife discovered that respectable households did not require their help to work 14-hour days without a day of rest between October and June. Tess had walked out on a Tuesday morning with her wages 4 weeks in arrears, her traveling case containing 2 dresses, a wool coat that was nearly good, a Bible she never read, and a small tintype photograph of her mother who had been dead since Tess was 15. She was not a woman given to self-pity. She had learned early that self-pity was a luxury that cost too much and paid nothing back. She had also learned that a woman alone in the Wyoming territory in 1882 had a narrow set of options, and most of them were varieties of misery. She could go back to Ohio, where her only living relative was a cousin who had made it clear. He considered her presence in his house a strain on his hospitality. She could find another domestic position, which meant finding the right kind of household, and hoping the right kind of household was not a fiction invented by women who had stopped hoping for better. She could consider the other options that presented themselves to women with nothing, and she had never yet considered those, and she did not intend to start. The notice on the bulletin board outside the Cheyenne post office was written in a hand that was careful and precise, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write well and had not needed to use the skill much since. It said, Seeking capable housekeeper for remote ranch property outside Buffalo, Wyoming. Winter employment, October through April. Room and board provided. Fair wages. Inquire H. Flynn, General Delivery, Buffalo. It was the word fair that caught her. Most notices said reasonable wages, which Tess had learned meant whatever the employer decided after the work was done. Fair wages implied something different. It implied a man who understood that fair was not a sliding scale. She wrote to H. Flynn at General Delivery, Buffalo, on a Wednesday. She received a reply by the following Tuesday, which was itself remarkable given the distance. The reply was brief. It said he had a large house and no inclination to maintain it himself, that the work would be hard but the compensation honest, that he expected punctuality and good sense and nothing else. He would provide a wagon from Buffalo on the 1st of October if she could be there. She was there. The wagon that met her in Buffalo was driven by a man named Otis Crane, who was 60-something and missing the last joint of his left index finger, and had the general air of someone who had been told to fetch the new housekeeper, and had decided to make his feelings about this errand known through the medium of complete silence. He loaded her traveling case into the back of the wagon without a word. He drove for 2.5 hours without a word. When they arrived at the ranch, which was set back from the road at the end of a long track between two stands of cottonwood that were mostly bare by then, he stopped the wagon and said, "The boss is in the barn," which were the only words he spoke for the entire journey. Tess climbed down from the wagon and looked at the house. It was a large house for the territory, 2 stories, built from timber that had gone gray in the weather. There was a wide porch across the front that someone had constructed with real care, the posts squared and set level, the boards fitted tight, though it needed sweeping. There were 2 chimneys. There were 6 windows on the front face and all of them needed washing. The yard between the porch and the gate held the remnants of a kitchen garden that had been let go to seed and dry weeds sometime in the past year, and the fence around it was missing 2 rails. Somebody had built this place carefully and then stopped caring about it. She found Hazel Flynn in the barn, which was where Otis had said he would be. He was not what she had pictured from his letter. She had pictured someone older, or smaller, or more worn down in the way that men sometimes got when they had been out in the territory long enough. What she found was a man of perhaps 32 or 33, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with a face that had seen weather and kept the evidence of it in the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the set of his jaw. His hair was dark with some gray at the temples that was too early for his age. His eyes were the particular gray of sky before a snowstorm, and they held the same quality as that sky, which was that you could not see through them to what was coming. He was working on a piece of tack when she walked in, a bridle that had a broken cheek piece. He looked up when her shadow crossed the barn door. "Miss Orland," he said. It was not a question. He seemed to have already settled the matter of who she was. "Mr. Flynn," she said. "Your house needs a good deal of work." He looked at her for a moment with those storm sky eyes. Then he said, "That's why I hired you." He was not unfriendly. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind because it mattered. He was not the kind of man who was unpleasant to be around. He was simply the kind of man who had drawn a hard line between himself and other people and had no interest in inviting her across it. He paid what he had promised on the last Friday of every month without being asked. He left a list of tasks on the kitchen table each morning without speaking to her about them. He ate the meals she cooked without complaint and with something that might have been gratitude if he'd let it get that far. He stayed out of her way and expected her to stay out of his. This was, Tess thought, a perfectly manageable arrangement. She threw herself into the house with the kind of energy that comes from needing something to fill a space that was too big for thinking. The kitchen took 3 days, the cast iron stove an entire morning by itself. She found a cleaning kit beneath the sink that told her someone had once cared very much about this kitchen. Someone who had organized the brushes by size and kept the lye soap in a proper container and had a specific place for everything. She wondered about that person while she worked, but she did not ask. The parlor took 2 days. The front rooms took a day each. The upstairs was complicated because it had 4 rooms, 3 of which were clearly unused and 1 of which was clearly Flynn's, and she cleaned the 3 unused ones without difficulty, and stood outside the 4th with her hand on the doorknob for a long moment before he appeared at the top of the stairs and said, "Not that room," in a voice that was not harsh but was absolutely final. She did not argue. She did not ask. She went back downstairs and began work on the root cellar. The first conversation that was not about tasks happened in the 3rd week of October, when the first real cold came in from the north and brought sleet with it that rattled the windows and made the ranch sound like it was being attacked from all sides. Tess had spent the afternoon putting away the stores she'd helped Otis haul from town the previous week: dried beans and salt pork and flour, and the other dry goods that would see the ranch through a hard winter. She had also found in the back of the larder 3 jars of preserved peaches that had been put up with care and were still good. She was holding one of the jars when Hale came in from outside, wet through, pulling off his coat. He stopped when he saw what was in her hands. She had not yet learned to read the full range of expressions on a face that did not offer many. But she was good at reading people, had learned it young out of necessity, and what she saw cross his face in that brief, unguarded moment was not anger. It was the specific quality of grief that strikes when you encounter something you had managed not to think about. "Should I leave these where I found them?" she asked carefully. He took his coat to the hook by the door and hung it without looking back at her. "No," he said. "Use them. That's what they're there for." "All right." She set the jar back on the shelf in its row. "My wife put those up," he said, which was information she had not asked for, and which told her that something about the sleet and the wet coat and the quiet kitchen had knocked loose something he usually kept stored as carefully as those peaches. She was good at that kind of thing. "I'm sorry," Tess said. "Was she gone long?" 2 years in November. He moved toward the stove to warm his hands and was quiet for a moment. She didn't like the territory much, but she tried. Tess thought about the organized cleaning kit under the sink and the kitchen garden that had been built with real intention. She thought about a woman who had tried in a place that asked more of a person than was always fair. "What was her name?" she asked. "Clara." He looked at the fire through the grate. "Clara Flynn." Tess nodded and went back to putting up stores, and after a minute he went back out into the sleet, and that was that. But something had shifted imperceptibly, the way ice shifts before it breaks. November came in hard. The sleet became snow, and the snow became the particular Wyoming variety that was less like falling water and more like a wall the world was building specifically to shut you in. Tess learned the rhythms of the ranch by feel. She learned that Hale rose before dawn regardless of weather, and came in for breakfast at 6:30 and 8 with his eyes on whatever was outside the window. She learned that he came in for the noon meal only if the weather was genuinely impossible, and ate outside with Otis and the 2 other ranch hands, a quiet young man named Del Marsh and an older hand named Pete Cahill, if it was anything short of a blizzard. She learned that he came in for supper at 7, and sometimes stayed at the kitchen table with a ledger, and sometimes disappeared into his study and closed the door. She also learned things about the ranch that he had not told her. She learned from Otis Crane, who turned out to be conversational after all once you understood that his silences were tests of patience rather than declarations of preference, that the Flynn ranch had been prosperous once and was less prosperous now. She learned that Clara Flynn had died of fever in the second winter after they arrived, and that Hale had not been the same man afterward. She learned that the ranch was carrying some kind of debt, though Otis was vague on the particulars, and that there had been a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Gideon Marsh, who was Dell's uncle and whose relationship with Dell was complicated. Complicated how? Tess asked. Dell's father was Gideon's brother, Otis said, shaving a piece of kindling by the fireplace without looking up. Dell's father died. Gideon claimed a share of the property. Dell didn't agree. Dell came to work for Flynn because he needed wages, and because being under Gideon's roof had gotten complicated in the way that situations get when one man wants something and another man won't give it. What does this have to do with Mr. Flynn's troubles? Gideon Marsh has been buying up land in this valley since 1879, Otis said. He's got a taste for it. He made an offer on this place after Clara died, when Flynn was not in a condition to be making decisions. Flynn turned him down. Gideon didn't appreciate the turning down. What kind of man is Gideon Marsh? Otis shaved another sliver of kindling and was quiet for a moment. The kind that doesn't hear no the first time, he said at last. Tess filed this information in the part of her mind where she kept things that were not her business, but that she might need to understand. The first time they talked for real, meaning the first time conversation moved between them the way rivers move, with direction and current, and the sense of something going where it needed to go, was in the second week of November. It was a Sunday, which was the one day Tess allowed herself something close to rest, meaning she cooked and cleaned and maintained the house, but did not attempt the larger projects. She had found a small collection of books in the parlor, real books, not pamphlets or almanacs, but novels and histories, and a volume of poetry that surprised her. She was reading by the fire when Hale came in from outside and sat down in the armchair across from her with his own book without asking or explaining himself, as though this were a perfectly ordinary thing to do. It was not a thing he had done before. She did not comment on it. She read her book. He read his. The fire worked between them. After a long, genuinely comfortable silence, he said without looking up, "What are you reading?" "A novel," she said. "Jane Eyre. Have you read it?" "Yes." "What did you think of Rochester?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought he was a man who believed his own story too much," he said. "The kind of man who thinks that wanting something badly enough justifies what he's willing to do to get it." Tess looked at him over the top of her book. "That's a very specific reading," she said. "It's the only reading that makes sense," he said. "Most people think he's romantic. Most people aren't thinking clearly about what he actually did." She thought about that. "No," she said at last. "I suppose they aren't." He went back to his book. She went back to hers. But something had been established that was not there before, the possibility of honest conversation, the shared understanding that they were both people who thought about things and did not require the other to pretend otherwise. It grew from there the way winter things grow slowly, under cover of cold, in ways you couldn't see until suddenly there was something green and real pushing up from the ground. She discovered that he played chess, or had played chess. There was a board in the study with pieces that were clearly well used. She mentioned in passing that she knew the game. Her father had taught her before he died when she was 12, and Hale had said, with the air of someone testing the weight of a door before opening it, "Do you play for stakes or just for the playing?" "Just for the playing," she said. "Though I'll warn you I'm not easy to beat." "Good," he said. "I don't want easy." They played that evening on the kitchen table after supper, and she beat him in 42 moves, which took some time because he was genuinely good and required real effort to defeat. He looked at the board for a long moment after the end and then looked up at her and said, "Again." And she had laughed, the kind of laugh she hadn't used in a long time, and said, "All right." December arrived with a cold that was not metaphorical but had physical presence, a weight and intention that you could feel in the walls of the house and the soles of your boots. Tess threw herself into the work of making the house ready for the full depth of winter, stuffing rags into the gaps in the window frames, checking the stores against her calculations of what 4 people would need, reorganizing the root cellar for maximum efficiency. She was practical and methodical about it in a way that pleased her, the pleasure of a problem that could be solved with enough intelligence and effort. She was also, without entirely meaning to, becoming more than an employee in the life of this house. She noticed when Hazel did not sleep, because she was a light sleeper herself and could hear the floorboards when he moved through the house in the deep hours. She noticed when something was weighing on him because his jaw took on a certain set and his eyes went to the distance and stayed there. She noticed when the ledger on the table showed numbers that troubled him because he would close it and not open it again for several days, as though distance from the facts might change them. She did not intrude on any of this, but she was aware of it in the way that you become aware of weather, not because you're looking for it, but because it's in the air and your body registers it before your mind does. The first week of December brought Gideon Marsh. He arrived on a Wednesday morning when Hazel was out on the range checking on the herd, which Tess later understood had not been accidental. He rode in on a bay horse that cost more than most men in the territory would ever see in a year and dismounted at the porch, as though he owned the place, which she suspected was the precise communication he intended. Gideon Marsh was perhaps 50, with a thick build and a face that had settled into the expression of a man who had gotten his way often enough to consider it a right. He wore a good coat and a hat that was too clean for actual work. He looked at Tess on the porch with the particular kind of dismissal that men like him used when they encountered women who were working, as though the work itself made her not quite worth addressing directly. "Flynn here," he said. "Mr. Flynn is out," Tess said. "I'll wait." "I'll let him know you called," Tess said, which was not the same thing as inviting him to wait. Gideon Marsh looked at her then with slightly more attention. He was the kind of man who was accustomed to people stepping aside, and here was a woman in a work apron who was politely and firmly not stepping aside. "You're the housekeeper," he said. "Yes." "How much is Flynn paying you?" Tess looked at him steadily. "That would be between Mr. Flynn and myself," she said. He almost smiled, but it didn't reach anywhere it would have needed to reach to be an actual smile. "I'll come back Thursday," he said. "Tell Flynn I want to talk about the eastern parcel again." "I'll tell him," she said. He remounted his horse and rode out, and Tess stood on the porch and watched him go and felt, very distinctly, the quality of a threat that had not yet declared itself. She told Hazel that evening. He was at the kitchen table with the ledger when she set his supper down and relayed the visit, keeping to the facts without editorializing. Hazel's face did not change much, but his hands went still on the ledger pages. "The eastern parcel," he said. That was what he said. "He's been after that land for 2 years. He closed the ledger. It's the best grazing on the property. Without it, the ranch doesn't work the way it needs to." "Why does he want it specifically?" Hazel looked up at her. It was the look of someone deciding whether to cross a line they'd been standing at. "Because he knows I need it," he said at last. "He's been buying up the water rights on the creek that runs through that parcel, piece by piece. If I lose the land, I lose access to the water and I lose the cattle operation." That's a kind of trap, she said. Yes, he said. It is. She sat down across from him without being invited, which was a thing she had not done before. She looked at the closed ledger and then at him. Is there something that can be done about the water rights? If I had money to buy them back, yes. If I had money to hire a lawyer, maybe. He looked at his supper. I don't have money for either right now. Is the ranch in serious trouble? He was quiet for long enough that she understood the answer before he gave it. The last 2 years have been hard, he said. Clara's illness cost more than we had. I've been getting it back slowly, but it's been slow. She nodded. She thought about the flour tin and the back of the larder, and the man across from her, who had learned to keep things hidden in spaces where they wouldn't be found. All right, she said. Eat your supper. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely identify. That's all you have to say. Right now, yes, she said. There's time to think about it, and you need to eat. The thing about Hale Flynn, which Tess was understanding gradually and with increasing certainty, was that he was not a man who had shut down from indifference. He was a man who had loved something very much and lost it, and had not yet found his way back from that loss. The ranch, the house, the careful ledgers, the long hours in weather that had no mercy, these were all a form of continuing that was not yet a form of living. He worked because stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant the whole weight of everything he'd put down since Clara died. She understood this because she recognized it. Her own version was different, the losses were different, the shape of the wound was different, but the coping mechanism was the same. Work until there is nothing left over for grief. Keep the hands busy so the mind has no purchase. What she did not understand, not yet, was what it would mean when someone finally held still long enough to let the feeling back in. Christmas came quietly to the Flynn ranch. There was no tradition of celebration. That much was clear from the bare way December had moved through the house without any acknowledgement. Tess did not have the materials for anything elaborate, but she had grown up in a house where her mother believed that something small and made with care was better than nothing, and she found she could not let Christmas pass without any mark at all. She cut pine boughs from the trees at the edge of the property and brought them inside. She made a wreath for the front door using wire she found in the barn. She made a ginger cake, using the spices she'd been hoarding carefully since October, because a Wyoming winter demanded at least one luxury, and this was hers. She set the table in the parlor on Christmas Eve with the good cloth she'd found in the linen chest, the one that had clearly been used for real occasions once. Hale came in from outside and stopped in the doorway of the parlor and looked at what she'd done. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "Supper is in 20 minutes. Otis and Dell and Pete Cahill joined them for supper, which was not the usual arrangement, but Tess had made enough, and there was no reason to pretend the season didn't exist. They ate around the big kitchen table, which was the right size for 5 people, and Otis told a story about a Christmas he'd spent in Santa Fe in 1861 that got longer and more elaborate as the evening went on, until Del Marsh started laughing and couldn't stop. Pete Cahill, who was a quiet man of strong opinions, said that ginger cake was the finest thing he'd eaten in 3 years, and looked at Tess with genuine sincerity when he said it. Hale said very little, but he stayed at the table longer than he usually did, and once, when she refilled his coffee cup, he looked up at her and said, very quietly, just beneath the noise of Otis's ongoing story, "Thank you, Tess," and used her name the way that meant something, not as an address but as an acknowledgement. She carried that with her when she went to bed that night, the way you carry a coal in your hands when the fire needs to be moved, carefully, knowing it can warm you or burn you depending on how you hold it. January was brutal. The kind of cold that is not just temperature, but something closer to intention, as though the world had decided that everything soft and warm needed to be tested until it either hardened or broke. The snow was deep, and the wind was relentless, and there were 3 days in the second week where the hands could not get to the cattle, and Hale stayed in the barn around the clock, and Tess brought food out to him on a tray wrapped in cloth and left it, and came back for the empty tray without making it into anything. Except on the third day, she found him in the barn at 3 in the afternoon, sitting on a hay bale with his head in his hands, which was something she had not seen before, and which stopped her in the doorway with the tray. She set the tray down on the grain bin beside him. She sat down on the hay bale at a proper distance and did not say anything for a long moment. "Cattle," she asked at last. "Lost 5 head in the northwest pasture," he said into his hands. "Couldn't get to them in time. I'm sorry. It's $200 I don't have." He lifted his head and looked at the barn wall with an expression she was starting to know, the one that meant he was calculating the distance between where he was and where he needed to be, and finding it too great. "Marsh is going to come back in spring. He always comes back in spring when the hard winter has done his work for him. Then we make sure the hard winter hasn't done enough of his work," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me what needs to happen," she said. "Not right now, when you've eaten and the storm has passed. Sit down with the ledger and tell me what needs to happen and what you have to work with, and we'll figure out what can be figured out." "Why would you do that?" he said. Not suspicious exactly, more like a man asking a question he genuinely could not answer. "Because it's the practical thing," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Is that the only reason?" Tess looked at the hay bale and then at the tray of food and then at him. She thought about the conversation she was not quite willing to have yet, the one about what was growing between them like green beneath the frozen ground. "Right now," she said, "it's the reason I'm prepared to talk about." He held her gaze a moment longer and then looked at the food on the tray. "It's getting cold," he said. "Then eat it," she said. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite there, but almost. The problem with the water rights, once Hale laid it out properly, was both worse and more solvable than Tess had initially understood. Gideon Marsh had acquired 3 of the 5 parcels along the creek that ran through the eastern grazing land. He had done this legally, through proper purchase, though the manner of his approach to the sellers had not always been gentle. He needed only 2 more parcels to control the creek entirely, and thereby render the eastern land useless for cattle without expensive water hauling that no ranch in this territory could sustain through a full season. The 2 remaining parcels were owned by 2 different people. One was a man named Asap Porter, who lived 8 miles north and who, according to Otis, had been resisting Gideon's approaches for 2 years but was getting older, and was not entirely certain his son wanted to take over the property. The other was held by an unlikely owner, a woman named Ruth Baines, who had inherited a small property from her late husband, and who ran it with a hired man, and a stubbornness that had reportedly made Gideon Marsh use language unbecoming a man of his claimed stature. "If Marsh gets even one of those 2, Hale said, looking at the rough map he'd drawn on a piece of paper, he doesn't need the other. He can squeeze the creek enough to make the eastern land impractical. Then the answer is to make sure he gets neither," Tess said. "Porter might sell. He's tired and his son doesn't want the responsibility. Has anyone asked Porter what he actually wants? Not what Marsh wants and not what his son wants." Hale looked at her. "Tired old men often want to know that the thing they built is going to be treated with respect," she said. "If you went to Asap Porter and talked to him as one rancher to another, not to buy his property but to explain why that creek matters to every ranch in this valley except Gideon Marsh's, He might find that his interests and yours are more aligned than he currently understands. That assumes Porter cares about anyone's interests but his own. Most people do care about more than their own interests, Tess said. They just need someone to ask the right question. Hale looked at the map for a long moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that was new, something she hadn't seen on his face before, which was the specific look of a person who has just realized that the person across from them is genuinely useful in a way that goes beyond what they anticipated. "You think like a strategist," he said. "I think like a person who has had to solve problems with limited resources," she said. "It's the same thing, mostly." He visited a sap porter the following week when the weather gave a 2-day break and the road north was passable. He came home with news that Porter had not sold and had no current plans to sell, and that the conversation had, in fact, gone much as Tess had predicted. Porter was not a man who trusted Gideon Marsh and never had been, but he had needed someone to articulate why the creek mattered and what Marsh was actually building toward, and Hale had done that. "He said he'd hold for now," Hale reported, standing in the kitchen with snow still on his coat. "He didn't make any promises about the long term." "That's enough for now," Tess said. "And Ruth Baines. I haven't spoken to her yet." "I could," Tess said. Hale looked at her. "I'm a woman," she said in the tone of someone making a very obvious point. Gideon Marsh has almost certainly been at her the way men like him approach women alone, which is with a combination of condescension and pressure. She might respond differently to another woman. There was a pause. "That's probably true," he said. "I'll need the wagon for a day," she said. He nodded. "I'll have Otis take you." Ruth Baines was a woman of perhaps 45 who had the posture of someone who had spent years being told to expect less, and had decided somewhere along the way to take up exactly as much space as she was entitled to. She received Tess in a kitchen that was clean and practical, offered coffee that was strong and good, and listened to what Tess had to say with the attention of someone who has learned to evaluate information carefully, because mistakes are expensive. When Tess finished, Ruth Baines set down her coffee cup and said, "I knew Gideon Marsh was building towards something. I didn't know the full picture." "Now you do," Tess said. "What does Flynn want from me? He doesn't want to buy my land." "He wants you to hold it," Tess said. "He wants to know that Marsh doesn't have a path to the creek." Ruth Baines looked at her for a long, measuring moment. "You work for Flynn," she said. "I do." "But this isn't just employer and employee," Ruth said. It wasn't quite a question. Tess thought about the chess games and the Christmas supper and the hay bale in the storm and the way he'd said her name. "It's complicated," she said honestly. Ruth Baines nodded slowly. "I'll hold the land," she said. "Not for Flynn's sake, for my own. Because that land was my husband's, and I'm not going to let a man like Gideon Marsh turn it into a piece of something ugly." She paused. "But you tell Hale Flynn that the creek matters to this whole valley, and if he ever finds a way to push Marsh back, I'd be glad to be part of it." Tess brought this back to the ranch and delivered it at supper with the straightforward clarity she brought to everything. Hale listened. He finished his supper. He looked at her across the table for a long moment and said, "You're remarkable." She was not accustomed to being told this and was not entirely certain what to do with it. "I solved a problem," she said. "You solved a problem in a day that I've been worrying about for 2 years," he said. "That's not the same as just solving a problem." She looked at her coffee cup. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." It was in January, in the 3rd week, that she found the letter. She had not been snooping. She wanted that to be clear to herself, because she was not a woman who snooped and she had no intention of becoming one. She had been reorganizing the larder, specifically the section behind the flour sacks where things tended to accumulate and get forgotten. and she had lifted a flour tin that had seemed lighter than it should be for a full tin, and had found that the bottom was false, and in the hollow beneath the false bottom was a folded piece of paper. She had not meant to read it. She had meant to fold it back and replace it and say nothing. But the tin had slipped in her hands and the letter had unfolded as it fell, and the words on the top line were visible before she could look away. And the words on the top line were, "Balance of account, H. Flynn, November 1882. Total funds, $1,847. She had looked at the rest of it then because the amount was too significant to unsee and too significant to understand without context. It was a bank statement. A real one from the Cattlemen's Bank in Cheyenne, dated November of 1882. It showed an account in Hale Flynn's name with a balance of $1,847, which was not a fortune, but was absolutely enough to have paid a lawyer and bought back at least one of the water rights parcels, and was more than the ranch's troubles had suggested he possessed. She stood in the larder for a long moment with the letter in her hands. Then she put it in her apron pocket. Then she went upstairs and stood at his bedroom door and knocked. He opened it. He was in his work shirt with his sleeves rolled, clearly going over something by the window, and he looked at her with the question already on his face because she had never knocked on his door before. She held out the letter. He went absolutely still. She watched him understand exactly what she was holding and what it meant that she was holding it, and she watched something that had been carefully maintained collapse behind his eyes, and she turned and went back downstairs to the kitchen and waited. He came down 4 minutes later. She had put the kettle on and was standing by the stove because she needed to be doing something with her hands. "Tess," he said. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me the truth about this letter or I walk out that door and I keep walking." And so they arrived, fully and completely, at the moment where the story had begun. The February wind against the house, the letter on the floor, the distance between them that was made of everything that had been built in 4 months of quiet proximity and everything that had been hidden. She picked up the letter from where he'd handed it back to her. She read the whole thing as he'd asked. The statement showed the $1,847 balance on November 1st. It also showed, when she read the accompanying page she hadn't fully processed in the larder, a note from the bank manager that said, "Mr. Flynn, per your request, this account is held separate from operating funds and is to be drawn on only in the event of a foreclosure action or a legal challenge to the deed. This is per the terms we discussed after Mrs. Flynn's death." She read it again. Then she read it a third time. She set the letter on the table. "Clara," she said. "She made me promise," he said. He was standing by the window with his arms crossed in the way he held himself when he was defending against something. "Before she died, she knew the ranch was in trouble. She knew that I would work myself down to nothing and give everything away before I'd let it go, because that's what I do. She made me promise I would keep that money separate and not touch it unless the deed itself was at risk. She said she didn't want to die knowing the last thing she gave me had been thrown away on a bad season. So you've been suffering through the debt and the pressure in Gideon Marsh," Tess said slowly, "with enough money hidden in a flour tin to at least begin solving the problem." "I was solving it," he said, slowly, "the way Clara wanted me to. She didn't want a quick fix. She wanted me to learn to manage it properly first. But you let me think," Tess said, and here was the thing, here was where the hurt lived. "You let me think that the situation was desperate and nearly lost when it wasn't. You let me go to a sap porter and Ruth Baines on your behalf as though we were standing at the edge of a cliff. The pressure from Marsh was real," he said. "I know it was real." She stood up and took 2 steps toward the window and turned back to him. "That's not what I'm upset about. I'm upset because you let me in far enough to care about what happened to this place and to you, And the whole time there was something you were keeping back. Something that mattered. She stopped. That's the part that feels like a betrayal. The word landed between them and stayed there. Hale uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor between them for a long moment, and when he looked up there was nothing protective in his face anymore. Nothing managed or maintained. He looked like a man who had finally stopped defending a position he'd been holding too long. "Clara's been gone for 2 years," he said. "I have been holding on to the promises I made her because I didn't know what it would mean to let them go. I didn't know if there was anything on the other side of letting them go that was worth it." He stopped. "And then you came." Tess was very still. "You walked in here with your traveling case and your good sense and your refusal to be anything other than exactly who you are," he said. "And you cleaned my house and fed me decent meals and beat me at chess and went and solved problems I'd given up solving. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I stopped being a man who was just surviving and started being something else. Something I hadn't been in 2 years." He met her eyes. "I should have told you about the money. You're right. It was a part of the picture I kept from you, and you deserved the whole picture." She sat back down in her chair. "Was Clara the dark past you've been holding on to?" she said quietly. "Not a dark past," he said, "just a past. One I loved, one I thought was all I was going to get. And now—" He sat down across from her, in his chair at his table. In the kitchen she had made livable again with her own hands, and he looked at her the way he hadn't allowed himself to look at her before, directly and completely. "I would very much like to know what is happening between us," he said, "if you're willing to tell me." "Something is happening," she said carefully. "Yes," he said, "I'm aware." "I'm not a woman who makes light of things," she said. "I'm not built that way. If I say something is happening, I mean something that matters." "So do I," he said. Outside, the February wind did one more savage pass over the house and then relented, not completely, but enough to let the fire be heard in the quiet. "All right," Tess said. "Then we should probably talk about that." They talked for a very long time. She told him about Cheyenne and the banker's household, and the wages in arrears and the bulletin board outside the post office. She told him about her father dying when she was 12 and her mother, when she was 15, and the cousin in Ohio, who had made her understand early that she was responsible for her own survival, and no one else's was her responsibility. She told him about the particular quality of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who don't see you. He told her about coming west from Virginia in 1876 with Clara, who had been brave and hopeful, and had held his hand in the wagon the whole way, even though she'd been frightened. He told her about building the house with his own hands and Clara's guidance, because she'd had opinions about everything from the height of the porch to the angle of the kitchen windows. He told her about the fever and the doctor who'd ridden 40 miles in 2 days and hadn't been quite enough. He told her about the morning after Clara died when he'd stood in this kitchen with his coffee gone cold and understood that a man could lose himself entirely if he let himself stop. "You didn't stop," Tess said. "I almost did," he said. "More than once. The first winter was very bad. But you kept going." "I didn't know what else to do." He looked at the fire. "I'm not sure that's courage, it might just be stubbornness. In my experience," Tess said, "they're the same thing most of the time." In March, when the first true hint of warmth came into the air, and the ice on the creek began to make sounds in the night that were the sounds of movement beginning, Hale Flynn rode into Buffalo and came back with a document from the Cattlemen's Bank in Cheyenne that authorized the transfer of funds to purchase the first of the 2 remaining water rights parcels on the creek. He had, by his own account, used precisely the approach that Tess had laid out in January, going first to a sap porter to make sure porter understood that the 2 of them together had enough combined leverage to push back properly against Gideon Marsh's position. Asap Porter had, in the end, sold his own parcel not to Marsh, but to Hale, at a fair price that Porter himself set, because Porter was a man who understood the value of a fair price and the importance of who you sold things to. This had required more of the reserve funds than was comfortable, but it had also meant that Marsh now had 3 of 5 parcels and was stalled, and that stall was worth more than comfort. Ruth Baines was not selling to anyone. She had, in fact, been to see a lawyer in Buffalo who had helped her formalize her property boundaries in a way that would make any future claim by Marsh considerably more difficult. She had sent a note to the Flynn ranch through Otis, which read, "The creek stays where it is. Tell the housekeeper she has good sense." Otis delivered this note with the expression of a man who found the entire situation entertaining and did not intend to pretend otherwise. The thing about spring in Wyoming is that it doesn't come in gently. It comes in with the same force as everything else in that territory, sudden and convinced of its own necessity. The cottonwoods along the track from the road put out leaves in what seemed like a single night. The kitchen garden began to show the possibility of real growth from the seeds Tess had started in the window boxes in February. The mountains to the west went from uncompromising white to something more complicated, white and shadow and the suggestion of green below. One evening in late March, Tess was in the kitchen garden with a hoe and a hat she'd borrowed from the peg by the door, working the soil that had been fallow since Clara's garden had gone to seed. She had plans for this garden. Practical plans, beans and squash and onions and the herbs that would make everything through the winter better, but also something beyond practical. A kitchen garden was a thing of intention, a statement that you expected to be here come harvest. Hale came out onto the porch and stood watching her work. "You're planning a big garden," he said. "The south end will get enough sun for tomatoes," she said. "You'd need to fix the fence rail." "I'll fix it tomorrow," he said. He leaned on the porch post. "Tess," she looked up from the hoe. "Your original agreement was through April," he said. She knew this. She had known it since January and had been not exactly not thinking about it, but had been choosing not to examine it too closely. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to discuss new terms," he said. She set the hoe against the fence and looked at him on the porch. This man she had spent a winter learning, this complicated, careful, profoundly lonely man who was starting to remember how to be present in his own life. "What kind of new terms?" she said. He came down the porch steps. He stopped at the edge of the garden at the repaired fence because she had asked him to fix the rail, and he had fixed it that same afternoon without mentioning it. "Permanent terms," he said. She looked at the fresh, turned soil, and the new fence rail and the mountains in the distance going complicated with spring. "You're going to need to be more specific than that," she said, though she was not entirely sure she didn't already know what he meant, had perhaps known it since February, and the fire and the long conversation and all the things that had grown from it in the weeks since. "I don't want a housekeeper," he said. "I want a partner, someone to build this with, someone whose opinion matters on every question from the water rights to the kitchen garden." He stopped for a moment, looking for the right words with the careful precision of a man who understood that some sentences could not be taken back and should not be. "I want to build the kind of life with you that this place was always supposed to be, that I let fall to pieces when I didn't know how to keep going." The spring wind came through the cottonwoods and moved the air between them, warm and with the smell of new earth and growing things. "Hale," she said. "I know it's quick," he said. "I know you came here for a winter's employment. I know I haven't been the easiest man to know. But I have not felt like myself in 2 years, and I have felt like myself since approximately the 3rd week of October, and that is you. That is entirely because of you." She came around the fence to where he was standing. She looked at him without the distance she had maintained for 4 months. Not the distance of propriety exactly, but the distance of caution, of a woman who had learned that hope was expensive and sometimes not worth the cost. "I'm not an easy woman," she said. "I have opinions about everything. I will fight with you over the ledger and the water rights and the way the parlor is arranged. And I will win most of those arguments because I am usually right." "I know," he said, and here, finally, was the almost smile that had been threatening for months, breaking through into something full and real and warm. "I'm not Clara," she said, and said it gently, but said it because it needed to be said. "I know that too," he said, and the way he said it was not a dismissal of Clara but an acknowledgement, a recognition that loving one person had not erased the capacity to love again, had perhaps even made it possible. "You're Tess, and Tess is who I'm asking." She reached out and took his hand. His hand, which had spent 4 months holding bridles and ledger books and tools and all the implements of a life being rebuilt, closed around hers with a certainty that felt like something long delayed arriving precisely when it was supposed to. "Then ask properly," she said. He did. They were married in May, in the parlor of the ranch house, which Tess had decorated with flowers she had cut from the kitchen garden and from the meadow along the creek where the water rights were now, at least partially, secure. The minister came from Buffalo. Otis Crane stood as witness with the expression of a man who had seen this coming since October and was personally satisfied that the rest of the world had caught up. Del Marsh was there, and Pete Cahill and Ruth Baines, who had ridden over in a very good dress that she'd clearly been saving for an occasion. There was no representative from Gideon Marsh's property, which was precisely as it should be. The ceremony was short, and the celebration afterward was not. And the food was good because Tess had made it, and Tess did not believe in doing anything badly. And by the end of the evening, Otis had told the Santa Fe Christmas story again to general laughter, and Del Marsh had danced with Ruth Baines' hired man's daughter in the yard in the spring dark, and Pete Cahill had fallen asleep in the parlor chair with his boots on, and nobody had the heart to wake him. Tess sat on the porch steps with Hale in the late evening and looked out over the ranch in the May dark, the cottonwoods gone fully leafy now, the kitchen garden planted and beginning in earnest, the mountains holding the last of the sunset in a band of color that went from gold to deep rose to the particular blue of high country dusk. "I own half your heart," she said. He looked at her. "You said that to me," she said, "in February. You said I'd taken half of something you hadn't known you still had to give." "I remember," he said. "I want it on record," she said. "That half is not enough." He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned to look at her fully, this woman who had arrived in October with a traveling case and had remade his house and his life and his understanding of what it meant to still be here, still building, still possible. "Noted," he said. "Consider the amendment filed." She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the warmth of May and the sound of the ranch settling into night around them. The summer was good. It was genuinely good, which was not something Hale had said about a summer in some time. The cattle came through the winter losses with strong numbers, and the new calves were healthy, and the eastern pasture, with the water rights holding, was as productive as it had ever been. The kitchen garden became the thing Tess had planned for it, abundant and organized, and a genuine source of satisfaction every time she walked through it, which was often. Gideon Marsh made one more approach in June, a legal letter this time rather than a personal visit, which suggested that the personal approach had run out of options. The letter raised a question about a boundary survey on the eastern parcel that was, as far as Hale could tell after reading it 3 times, and showing it to Tess, and then to the lawyer in Buffalo, entirely without merit, a manufactured dispute designed to create uncertainty and cost. Tess read the letter twice and set it on the table with a precision that suggested she was resisting the urge to do something more emphatic with it. "He's running out of moves," she said. "I know," Hale said. "We should have the survey done properly and on record," she said. "Remove the ambiguity entirely. I was thinking the same thing, and Ruth Baines and a SAP porter should both be informed. If Marsh is looking for boundary disputes, he'll try the same thing on them." "Yes." She looked at the letter. "This is a desperate move," she said. "It's the kind of thing a man does when he's been stalled long enough that he's starting to understand the stall might be permanent." "Let's make sure it is," Hale said. "The survey was done by July. It confirmed what they already knew." The lawyer in Buffalo sent a response to Marsh's letter that was polite and complete, and left no room for argument. Marsh went quiet after that, not permanently, Tess suspected. Men like Marsh didn't give up. They reassigned their attention to easier targets and came back when they thought you'd relaxed. But for now, he was quiet. The summer moved forward with the specific quality of a life being rebuilt on better terms. Hale laughed more, which was a thing Tess had been waiting for without quite realizing she was waiting for it. He laughed at the chess games, which she still won more often than not, but which were closer now because he'd been paying attention. He laughed at Otis's stories, which had apparently always been funny, but which he'd stopped hearing properly somewhere in the darkness of the last 2 years. He laughed at himself once in the kitchen garden, when he stepped on the hoe handle in a way that was entirely avoidable and would have been amusing to anyone watching. And the sound of it, full and genuine and completely unguarded, made Tess stop what she was doing and just look at him for a moment. He caught her looking and said, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "I like the sound of that." He understood what she meant. He came over and took the trowel from her hand and set it down on the garden fence, and kissed her in the middle of the kitchen garden in the summer afternoon with the mountains behind them, and the tomatoes coming in properly, and the whole of the valley spread out around the ranch in its best summer color. And it was not a dramatic kiss, or a tragic kiss, or the kind of kiss that carried the weight of everything terrible that had happened before it. It was a happy kiss, simple and warm and entirely itself. In August, Tess was ill for a week in a way that was not the flu and not a summer cold, and which Tess understood, after a few days of quiet calculation, meant something different entirely. She was not certain right away. She was careful in her certainty, because this was not a thing to be casual about. But by the end of the week, she was certain. She told Hale on a Sunday evening when the light was long and golden on the porch, where they had taken to sitting after supper in good weather. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to sit still while I tell it." He sat still. He was getting better at sitting still, she told him. He did not move for a long moment. He looked at the middle distance, at the long Wyoming evening, and his face went through several things that Tess watched carefully because she needed to know what was in them. What was in them, in the end, was not fear or grief or the shadow of Clara and what had been lost. What was in them was something she recognized because she'd seen it on him in February in the kitchen, when he'd said her name the way that meant something. He turned to her with his full face open and said, "Are you all right? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'll be better once the mornings are easier." "The mornings," he repeated, as though storing this information carefully. "It passes," she said. "Mostly." He took her hand. His hands were the same hands she'd been looking at since October, broad and work-hardened and gentle when they needed to be. Tess, he said. Hale, she said. I'm happy, he said. I need you to know that I am very, very happy. She had known he would be. She had known it in the way she knew most things about him now, completely and from the inside out. But hearing it said, plainly and without qualification, was its own thing. Good, she said. So am I. The winter came again. The second winter of their acquaintance and the first of their marriage, and it was still cold and still demanding, and still required the full attention of everyone on the ranch to navigate properly. But it was different in the way that hard things are different when you are not facing them alone. Tess moved through the house that was now fully hers, not just in the sense of the legal paper Hale had added her name to in June, but in every other sense, and she felt the weight of it as something good rather than something heavy. She had put her hands into every corner of this house. She had made it livable, and then made it warm, and then made it home, and she understood now that this was not merely the labor she'd been hired for. It was the work of a person building a life in a place they intended to stay. Otis, who had taken to joining them for supper more evenings than not since the wedding and who nobody had formally invited, but everybody welcomed, because Otis was family in the way that some people simply became family, had opinions about the baby. It'll be a boy, he said, with the certainty of someone who has no particular basis for this opinion but holds it firmly. You have no way of knowing that, Tess said. I have a feeling, Otis said. Your feeling also told you that the spring roundup would be done in 3 days, Dell said from the other end of the table, and it took 6. Those were different circumstances, Otis said with dignity. What would you name a boy? Dell asked. Tess and Hale looked at each other across the table. This was a conversation they'd had privately in the way that the important conversations happened now, quietly and thoroughly and between themselves. James, Hale said. After my father. James Flynn, Tess said. We thought about William after Clara's father, but Hale's father was James and James fits better. There was a brief, collective pause at the table, the kind that happened when something real was said about Clara and the past, and how the past was held. Clara would have approved of you, Ruth Baines said. She had come for supper that evening because she occasionally did. I knew her before she died. She was the kind of woman who would have approved of someone who didn't put up with nonsense. Tess smiled. That's the best thing anyone has said to me, she said. I mean it as the highest compliment, Ruth said. The baby was born on a cold morning in April, the next April, spring's second coming to the Flynn ranch, with the mountains still holding winter above the tree line but the valley floor green and new. The midwife from Buffalo had arrived 2 days before, staying in the spare room and eating Tess's cooking with the appreciative concentration of a woman who spent most of her professional life in conditions that did not include good food. Otis had been right. James Flynn arrived in the world on an April morning with the conviction of someone who had decided to do this on his own terms, which Tess suspected was a trait inherited from both sides. And he was healthy and loud and present in the way that new life is present, which is absolutely and entirely. Hale held his son in the kitchen of the house he'd built and watched Tess sleeping in the bedroom after the long work of the morning, and felt, for the first time in several years, that the scale of things had come back into proper balance. Not because the grief was gone. Grief doesn't go. It becomes part of the structure of a person and you carry it forward with you, but because the grief was no longer the whole thing. There was more now. There was Tess, who was the more. There was James, who was more still. He took the baby to the window and showed him the ranch in the April morning. Cottonwoods along the track, he said quietly, so as not to wake Tess. Kitchen garden. Your mother's tomatoes go here along the south fence. The eastern pasture is past that line of trees. He paused. The creek runs through it. We had a fight over that creek last year and your mother won it for us. She does that." The baby regarded the window with the grave concentration of someone who is taking notes. "You'll learn things from her," Hale said. "I recommend paying attention." Later that spring, when James was a month old and Tess had recovered herself fully and was back in the kitchen garden with the baby in a basket in the shade of the fence, Gideon Marsh wrote a final letter. This one was different in tone from the previous ones, more formal and more final. It said that he was withdrawing his interest in the eastern parcel and the associated water rights dispute, and that he was directing his attention elsewhere in the territory. Tess read the letter at the kitchen table with James asleep against her shoulder and handed it to Hale without comment. He read it, he set it down. "It's over," he said. "It's over," she agreed. "Why now, do you think?" "Because he found out the survey is on record and Ruth Baines has a lawyer and a sap porter sold to you," she said. "And because men like Marsh are calculating, he's not giving up. He's moving on to something easier. We weren't easy." "No," Hale said, with something in his voice that was unmistakably pride. "We were not." She looked at him over the sleeping baby and felt, in the complicated warmth of the spring morning, the fullness of what had been built. Not just the legal facts of it, the deed with her name on it now, the water rights secured, the kitchen garden and the repaired fence and the scrubbed kitchen stove. But the thing underneath and between all the practical facts, the partnership, the trust, the particular kind of love that comes from having been genuinely seen by another person in the middle of hard circumstances and found worth seeing. "Hale," she said. "Yes." "You said in February that I'd taken half your heart." "I did say that. I want to revise that," she said. "I think we've been operating on a different accounting since May." He looked at her across the kitchen table, his son asleep in her arms, the April light in the window, the ranch that was theirs on every side. "A different accounting," he said. "The whole thing," she said. "Not halves, just the whole thing. Both directions." He got up from his chair and came around the table and sat down beside her, close enough that James, who seemed to have opinions about being jostled even while asleep, made a small noise of protest before settling back. Hale put his arm around her carefully, with full attention to the sleeping weight she was holding, and pressed his mouth to her temple and said, very quietly into her hair, "The whole thing. Both directions. As long as there is such a thing as directions." She leaned into him. The fire in the hearth, which she had learned to lay in October and had been laying every morning since, crackled in the quiet. Outside, the spring went about its business. The cottonwoods were green and fully declared. The kitchen garden was planted and beginning. The creek ran through the eastern pasture, with the sound of water that was going where it was meant to go, unobstructed and clear. The same sound it had been making since before any of them had been here to hear it, and the same sound it would keep making long after, the continuous particular music of water finding its way. James Flynn slept through all of it with the untroubled sleep of someone who has arrived at the right place and knows it. The summer that followed was the kind of summer that you measure other summers against afterward. The cattle were strong and the range was good, and the kitchen garden was more productive than even Tess's most optimistic February projections had suggested. She put up jars of tomatoes and peaches and beans, and set them in the cellar in their rows with the satisfaction of someone who was laying up not just stores but evidence. Evidence that this house and this ranch and the people in it were going forward. She found, one afternoon in July, that she had straightened the jars of preserved peaches that Clara had put up 4 years ago, and that still sat on the shelf where she had left them. And she had dusted the jars carefully and set them back in their row without moving them from the place they'd always been. And she had felt, doing this, Not competition with the woman who had been here before her, but something closer to kinship. Two women who had understood what it meant to take care of a place and a person in a territory that did not make either easy. She told Hale about this later, simply, the way she told him most things. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Clara would have liked you," he said. "I think she would have found you funny and formidable in equal measure." "I'll take that," Tess said. "You should. She was a good judge of character." In September, when James was 5 months old and had developed a strong personality regarding his opinions on most things, Del Marsh came to Hale with something on his mind. He had been saving it for weeks. It was clear in the way he'd been slightly sideways around the kitchen table. He sat down after supper one evening and told Hale that he'd been in correspondence with his Uncle Gideon's lawyer, and that the lawyer had informed him that Gideon Marsh had no legal claim on Del's father's land that would hold up, that the original claim had been based on a will that had been superseded by a later document that Gideon had been aware of and had suppressed. Hale looked at Del for a long moment. "How long have you known this?" he said. "The lawyer only told me last month," Del said, "but I suspected for a while." "What does this mean for you practically?" Del straightened in his chair. He was 23, this quiet young man who had come to the Flynn ranch 2 years ago because he'd needed wages and because his uncle's house had gotten complicated. "It means I have a legal claim on a piece of land that I didn't think I had," he said. "It means I might be able to start something of my own in the spring." Hale extended his hand across the table, and Del took it, and the handshake was the kind that meant something real. Tess, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway with James in her arms, came in and sat down at the table. "Del," she said. He looked at her. "Don't let your uncle intimidate you out of what's yours," she said. "Get a lawyer, get the document properly filed, and hold your position. You know how that works. You've watched it done this past year." He nodded. Something in his face settled into a resolution that had been finding its way there for some time. "I do know how it works," he said. Pete Cahill, who had been listening with his coffee and had the general air of someone who appreciated a good resolution when he witnessed one, said, "Good. Now someone tell me whether there's more of that ginger cake, because I have been thinking about it since December." There was, in fact, more ginger cake. Tess had made one the previous afternoon, because it was a good October, and the kitchen smelled like spices, and she was a woman who understood the relationship between what a house smelled like and what the people in it felt like. James Flynn, 5 months old and possessed of strong opinions, reached for the cake from his mother's arms with an expression of profound intent. "Not yet," Tess told him. He looked at her with the gray eyes he'd gotten from his father, which on Hale looked like storm sky and on James looked like the particular focused determination of someone who was going to revisit this question when circumstances changed. "He's going to argue with you when he can form the words," Hale said. "Good," she said. "He should." The autumn turned toward the second winter, and the house was ready for it in a way it had not been the previous October when Tess arrived with her traveling case and found a house that had forgotten how to be warm. The stores were well laid. The stove was clean and maintained. The window gaps were sealed, and the firewood was stacked in the covered pile by the side of the house in proper rows that Pete Cahill had cut, and Tess had organized with an efficiency that Pete had called impressive, and Otis had called terrifying in the most affectionate possible register. Tess stood on the porch one evening in late October, James on her hip, and looked out over the ranch in the last of the good light. The cottonwoods had gone gold, and some of them were losing their leaves now, the same as they'd been when she had arrived a year ago on that first October, except that they were not a landmark she was approaching for the first time anymore. They were hers. They were the trees at the end of her track, the ones she knew by their specific shapes and the way they moved in the wind and the particular quality of light they let through in the afternoon. Hale came up behind her and stood at her shoulder and looked out over the same view. "A year," he said. "A year and a month," she said. "I arrived the 1st of October. You told me the house needed a great deal of work," he said. "It did. You were not wrong." She looked at the kitchen garden, which had been put to bed properly for the winter. The beds turned and the seeds of next year's garlic already in the ground. She looked at the fixed fence and the swept porch and the mountain beyond going complicated with the last colors of the season. "Hale," she said. "Yes. The first winter I came to clean your house," she said, "and I ended up in the middle of your life." "You did," he said. "How do you feel about that?" He was quiet for a beat, which was his way of giving a question the respect it deserved before he answered it. James, who had been watching the cottonwoods with the focused attention of someone very new to the world and finding it full of interesting material, made a sound that might have been an opinion. "I feel," Hale said, "like a man who came very close to missing the most important thing and didn't." She turned her head and looked at him. The man she had found in a barn on a cold October morning with a broken piece of tack in his hands and a house full of grief, and a reserve of capability and decency that he had been applying in entirely the wrong directions, inward against himself, instead of outward and forward. "Neither did I," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the way she had learned she could, completely and without hesitation. And James Flynn, 5 months old and entirely unaware of the full architecture of the life he'd been born into, put one small hand on his mother's coat with the confidence of someone who understood at a cellular level that this was the right place to be. The winter came in. The house held against it, warm and steady and full of the sounds of 3 people living with intention in a place they'd chosen for each other. Otis came for supper most evenings and told his stories. Del Marsh began the process of filing his claim, with a lawyer and a document and Hale's testimony when it was needed. Ruth Baines sent a Christmas pie in December with a note that said she had found a new use for her good dress, and that her hired man's daughter and Del Marsh had come to an understanding, which was stated without explanation and required none. Tess put up the pine boughs again. She made the ginger cake. She set the table with the good cloth. At supper on Christmas Eve, with the fire and the food and the people who had become the particular family that is made rather than inherited, Hale looked around the table at the assembled faces, and then at his wife across from him with their son in her arms and said nothing, because nothing was needed. Tess looked back at him with the directness that was the first thing he'd ever noticed about her, on an October morning in his own barn. This woman who had walked into his house with her traveling case and her good sense and her absolute refusal to be invisible. She had come to clean his house for the winter. She had ended up owning not half his heart but the whole of it, and every acre of this land that bore both their names, and the life they were building in it, inch by inch, season by season, with the same care and the same intention that went into every jar of preserved peaches, and every bed of garlic turned down for winter, and every fire laid and lit in the cold morning dark. By spring, there had been no question at all. There never really had been.